Well, hello, my fellow Rustaceans. It is so wonderful to be here with you, whether it's here in the great city of Albuquerque or online across the world. When we use the word Rust in the context of this conference, a few different things come to mind. Rust is a programming language. That's the reason a lot of us are here today. Rust is also a compiler whose error messages never shame us, but guide us in writing better code. Rust is also an ecosystem of libraries, frameworks, binaries, and much more. And all of these aspects of Rust depend on the Rust open source community. And let's zoom in on that now. The Rust community includes the members of the project itself, the Rust Foundation, and Rust Crate maintainers. Let's give all three of these groups a round of applause. Our community also includes the educators who teach us Rust through classes, books, tutorials, and more. Who here has benefited from a Rust educator? Yeah, let's give all those educators a big round of applause. And the community also includes the incredible individuals who organize our meetups and events. Events like the one we're at right now. Let's give the RustConf organizers and all the incredible volunteers a giant round of applause. Finally, our community also includes Rust users. And by Rust users, I mean anyone who is interested in Rust at any level and in any role. That means every single one of you is a member of the Rust community. One more time, give yourselves a round of applause. Many of us here in this room and online belong to more than one of these groups. You might say we wear multiple hats. For instance, I am the lead editor of This Week in Rust. That's one hat. Who here subscribes to This Week in Rust? Excellent. Well, I certainly hope those of you who don't sign up for it. And even though I'm the lead editor of This Week in Rust, I am far from the only editor and reviewer. This Week in Rust would not happen without the incredible members of my team. I could not do it without them. In addition to my This Week in Rust hat, I also am a Rust Foundation board member. How many people from the Foundation staff and board are here in the audience today? We got a few hands up, and I know we've definitely got more out there by the Rust Foundation table. So if you have questions about the Foundation, please feel free to talk to any of these people throughout the conference. And finally, I also wear the hat as of a principal engineer at Microsoft, where I have the privilege of using Rust in my work. And I know I am not the only one here who wears multiple hats. When we wear many different hats, it can be a struggle to communicate effectively, especially because it can be hard to know which hat to wear at any given time. And it's even harder when there's a conflict between two hats. What if our duties and obligations from one area conflict with our duties and obligations in another area? Well, we'll go into how to handle that later in this talk. Whoops. But as I was preparing for today, I was trying to find a metaphor to explain the different ways we Rustaceans communicate with each other. And I turned back to a few years ago when I gave a talk at Rust Belt Rust, which used Dungeons and Dragons metaphors to explain Rust traits. And this was by far my most popular talk, so my first instinct was to turn to Dungeons and Dragons metaphors again for this talk. However, as I wrote it, as I took it through several drafts, I realized that just as we can use a real life or a fantasy metaphor to explain a technical concept, we can also use technical metaphors to explain real life concepts. And let's start this metaphor by representing a Rustacean with a struct. In Rust, we often use structs or types to represent data. In this struct, we store a name and email address as strings. And let's create an instance of this struct. This is the null Rustacean struct, which stores my name and my email address. And now that we have our data, we also need to define some behavior for this data. And let's think of some behavior that all Rustaceans can do. One of those behaviors is open an RFC, or request for comments, in the Rust RFC's GitHub repo. Additionally, as Rustaceans, we can also comments on RFCs. That's the whole point of a request for comments, to gather comments from across the Rust community. When we program in Rust, we often use traits to capture behavior that may be shared among different types. So let's go ahead and create an RFC trait. Here's our trait, and now let's add in a trait method. Open an RFC, and another method to comment on an RFC. And even though I'm not showing the details on the slide, let's pretend both of these methods have default implementations. In traits, when we have a default implementation of a method within that trait, that implementation will be used unless we override it when we implement the trait. And speaking of implementing, let's do just that and implement the RFC traits on our Rustacean struct. If you were in the Rust trainings yesterday, this probably looks pretty familiar. This allows an instance of the Rustacean struct to access and use the traits methods. And let's look at this in action. Here's our instance of the Rustacean struct. And if we try to use the openRFC method, since we have the RFC trait implemented on our struct, this code will compile successfully. Similarly, when I use the comments RFC method, it also compiles successfully. So yay, we've created a struct to represent a Rustacean and also a trait to represent behavior related to RFCs. And let's think for a second, what's something else that all Rustaceans can do? Contribute to This Week in Rust. I certainly hope many of you here today and many of you watching online will write up your experience of RustConf and submit it to This Week in Rust. To capture this behavior in our technical metaphor, let's go ahead and create another trait, contribute to This Week in Rust. And then let's add in a trait method. Add in a method to open a GitHub pull request. That's one of the best ways to submit content to This Week in Rust. Now let's go back to our Rustacean struct, where we've already implemented the RFC traits, and let's go ahead and add in an implementation of the contribute to This Week in Rust trait. Now all Rustaceans can use this traits methods. And let's look at this in action. Going back to our instance of the Rustacean struct, where we let's again attempt to use the open the pull request method, and it compiles successfully, so yay. At this point, we've seen several examples of things that all Rustaceans, including every single one of you, can do. But there are some things that only certain groups of Rustaceans can do. For example, editing This Week in Rust. Anyone can contribute to the newsletter, but only This Week in Rust editors can edit it. To illustrate this, let's make a new struct. And this is the TWR, shortened from This Week in Rust, editor struct. This struct has a Rustacean field, which stores an instance of the Rustacean struct. I like to think of this as a Rustacean who is wearing an editor hat. This pattern, associating an instance of a struct with an instance of another struct, is called structural composition in Rust. And if you are hearing this and thinking, wait a minute, wouldn't using a generic type field in the Rustacean struct work better for this example? And the answer to this is in real world code, yes. Generic types would likely work better. But for the sake of the metaphor, as well as keeping the slides from getting too complicated and staying within the time bounds of this talk, I elected to use structural composition for these examples. If you'd like to talk more about this, feel free to find me at the conference. Going back to our code, editing this week in Rust is a pretty unique behavior. It's not likely that we're going to share this behavior with different types. Therefore, rather than using a trait, let's implement some methods directly on the struct. Starting with the merge pull request method, the ability to merge pull requests. This is one of the core responsibilities of editing. Community members submit content to our repo, and we, the editors, decide whether to merge those contributions in. And let's go ahead and see this in action. First, if we were to take an instance of the regular Rustacean struct and attempt to use a method that was not implemented for it, we would get a compiler error. However, if we create an instance of the twr editor struct and associate that with our instance of the Rustacean struct, we can call this method successfully. We just need to have the correct hat on. And let's go ahead and consider one more hat. What about a Rust Foundation board member hat? I'm from Seattle, so I elected to use a little ski hat for my Rust Foundation board member hat. Well, once again, let's go ahead and create a new struct to represent a Foundation board member. And once again, our struct has a Rustacean field, but now we also have a director type field. To represent this type, let's bring in another Rustacean concept, or another Rust concept, and use an enum. An enum which includes two types of Foundation directors, corporate directors and project directors. And if you would like to hear more about why there's these two types of directors on the board, check out Sage Griffin's Rust Foundation Demystified talk later today. At this point in our code, we have our data represented as a struct and an enum, and now we need to be able to do things with this data. And what's something that a Foundation board member does? They attend board meetings. So let's capture this behavior in one more trait, the board meeting trait. And we're using a trait here rather than implementing it directly on the struct because board meetings, while they do include Foundation board directors, they also include some Foundation staff members. So we might want to implement this behavior for multiple types. This trait will contain an attend board meeting method, which once again has a default implementation in it. Going back to our board member struct, let's implement the board meeting trait for RF board director, or RF board member. And now all instances of the board member struct can attend board meetings. And one more time, let's look at this in action. Let's start with a normal Rustacean, so one who does not have the Foundation board member hat on. If we try to use the attend board meeting method, we get a compiler error because our trait is not implemented for the Rustacean struct. However, if we use an instance of the board member struct associated with that Rustacean, again, putting the correct hat on, then it compiles successfully. When you wear multiple hats, it can be hard to know what hat to wear at what time. And when you're not sure which hat you should be wearing, the answer is always the most appropriate for the current situation. For example, when I am reviewing a pull request into This Week in Rust and deciding whether to merge it, I cannot make that decision with my board member hat on. My feelings as a board member cannot be used to determine what should be in This Week in Rust. I have to put on my editor hat and evaluate the pull request based on the standards we, the editors, have set for what we include, regardless of how I might feel about something from a board member context. And this brings us to another question. What if there's a conflict between two of our hats? For example, what if someone submits an article to This Week in Rust that is critical of a foundation action or initiative? In cases where there's a conflict, it is vital to bring someone else in, someone without that conflict. In this case, and this very example has happened, I needed to bring in another editor or editors to make that decision. And speaking personally, it can be really hard to let go of a decision that I feel a lot of ownership over. But the best thing for the project is for that decision to be made by someone without the conflict. And in an ecosystem as big as Rust, all of us wear very different hats. It's impossible for any one of us or any group of us to have awareness of everything going on in the Rust world at any time. That means it is critical for us to communicate effectively through widely understood channels. This is critical not only to the success of Rust, but also to its very survival. For example, going back to our code metaphor, let's make a new instance of the Rustacean struct. Let's make one for a new Rustacean named Ferris. And let's say Ferris has some idea or some feedback about the Rust Foundation and wants to talk to a Foundation staff member. Well, let's create an example of a staff member. First, by creating another Rustacean. We've all met Sage at this point, at the start of this conference, so let's start by creating an instance of the Rustacean struct for Sage. And then, let's make a Foundation staff member struct that we can associate with this Rustacean. And an instance of the struct for Sage, associated again with the Sage Rustacean. And this one has the title of Communities Advocate. At this point, we have a regular Rustacean, and we also have the Sage Foundation staff member, Rustacean with the Foundation staff member hat on. Now Ferris needs a way to communicate with Sage. I also am just realizing I used a little chef hat for Sage, and we've got a chef's conference going on another floor in this convention center. So one of the official channels of communication between the Rust community and the Foundation staff is through the Rust language Zulip chat. And since this chat behavior will be shared among different structs, let's go ahead and create a Rust Zulip trait. Within this trait, let's make a log onto Zulip method, and then a send message method, which takes a string argument to represent the message. Now that we have our traits, let's go ahead and implement this on the Rustacean struct so that Ferris can use it. And we also need to implement it for the Foundation staff member struct. So let's go ahead and implement it. And this was a little confusing to me first when I was learning about structural composition because I came from traditional inheritance-based languages. We still need to implement the same traits for these two different structs, even though they are related. So now that this trait is implemented for both structs, we can create a function to communicate on Zulip and use a trait bound to ensure that any type passed to it has the Rust Zulip trait implemented on it. So yay, now the two of them can interface on Zulip freely. And Zulip is far from the only place we interface with each other as a community. We also communicate a lot on GitHub. This is one of the main venues I use to interact with other members of our community. And there are also the official Rust Discord servers. The Rust Discord was immensely helpful when I was learning Rust. No matter how basic a question I felt I was asking, no one ever called me a noob. They answered the question in a supportive way. And it is still helpful to me today when questions occasionally pop up. And there are also the Rust forums, which I find very useful both for finding historical information about the language as well as current information. And there are definitely other channels as well. So it's great that we have so many ways to communicate, but sometimes that makes it hard to know which interface to use for what context. What goes on Zulip? What goes on Discord? What goes in GitHub repos, etc.? And who decides that in the first place? Well, the people who decide what interface to use for a given context are the people who wear the most appropriate hat for that context. It's up to each team, each group, each organization to determine what venue works best for their particular needs. And all of us need to respect that. That said, there are some places where we need to use caution when communicating. I think of using these places for communication, like using unsafe blocks in Rust programs. Unsafe does not mean you should not do something. I use unsafe blocks, for example, when I'm working on a crate and I want to implement a C API into it. The only way to do that in the way that I want to do it is through unsafe blocks. So it does not mean you should not do something. What it means is you need to be extra careful when you do, because you can unintentionally introduce undefined behavior. And communication-wise, the places we need to be most careful of undefined behavior are when we're discussing things on social media. To me, social media is an unsafe function that needs to be used within an unsafe block. Again, unsafe does not mean you should not do something. I'm certainly not going to tell you you shouldn't talk about Rust on social media. Sometimes it's the only way to accomplish what you need to do. Unsafe simply means you must be extra careful when you do this. Sometimes discussions on social media, even when the people having the discussion have only good intent, they can be noticed by people who had truly bad intent. In the past year, we unfortunately have seen examples of this, where a conversation on social media got heated and was noticed by people outside of the Rustacean community who then descended as a troll swarm. These troll swarms flooded members of our community with vile harassment and threats. No one deserves to have a troll swarm brought down on them. Just as when we're programming in Rust, we need to be very careful of unintended consequences when we write programs with unsafe blocks, we also need to be very careful of unintended consequences when we're discussing things in venues like social media. As I move toward concluding this talk, I hope you leave with this. No matter what hat you wear in the Rust community, or even if you don't feel you wear a hat yet at all, you are welcome. You are needed. You are valued. We are glad you are here. As you go through this conference, I hope you talk to others, whether it's in person or on Discord, about what hats they wear in the Rust community. Maybe you'll find something that interests you. There are so many different ways to get involved. And when you do find a hat you'd like to wear, I hope you'll write it up and submit the write-up to This Week in Rust, because that means I then get to put my favorite hat on and welcome you in yours. Thank you.